will explain that we we were bringing supplies.
It was tough to get everything from everybody.
Welcome, everybody. I would like to get the show on the road, so to speak. Thank you for joining us tonight to share some memories, and honor our veterans. Before we begin, would you please stand up and join me for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our first program guest, Donna Kessner from Oswego County Veterans Services. She's the director, and she has been with them for 17 years, as well as being a veteran of 4 years service in the Army, right? Please welcome Donna.
I just wanted to start out and say that I am a U.S. Army veteran, and my dad's not in the book, but this is my dad from World War II. He truly was my hero. He was shot in the head in World War II, and he was literally the nicest person that I've ever known. And he's the reason why I went into the Army. This is a magnet that I keep on my file cabinet. He looks over my shoulder every day at work. And I just want to say, the Korean veterans, the World War II veterans, our present military, all the veterans, it's just unbelievable the pleasure that I have and the honor that I have to listen to your stories, and I hear them every day. And not for 1 second do I ever get tired of them. They're all different. They're all from the heart. Bittersweet. Some people had a great time in the military, some people didn't. But they formed a lot of friendships. It's something that they'll never forget in their lives, whichever way they feel about it. So I have a sign in my office that says, do what you love every day. And I am definitely doing that. And I want to thank all of you. I try to thank you all for your service when you're in my office. And if we can do nothing but just pass it on to our other generations, then we'll be thanking our veterans. So to the men and women that have served our country, I salute you. Thank you.
And just one thing I wanted to mention about Donna that you may not have known. In 2015, she was the first female to be awarded the New York State Veterans Service Officer of the Year Award for her innovative services and outstanding advocacy for the veterans. And now I would like to introduce, from Senator Patty Ritchie's office, Dave Polito. Did I say it right? And as you all know, Senator Ritchie has been a grand supporter of the veterans, and several of the Fulton veterans have been added to the Veterans Hall of Fame thanks to her. Dave?
Thank you for the invitation to attend tonight's event. Due to a previous commitment, I am unable to join you. I wanted to express how grateful I am that events like this that shine a spotlight on the history of this great community can happen. Tonight, we will listen to many of Fulton's past and the vets who have given so much to this country. It is these that remind us of the selfless will that defines so many people living in Fulton. In closing, I would like to thank all who have had a hand in shaping this project. Because of the time and dedication, nights like this can be made possible. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce the project team for this year's project, just so you know who we all are. Not that you don't know already, but I'm Betty Mate from the Fulton Public Library. Jim Fafaya, one of our local authors. Mary Kimball, retired teacher, who is the inspiration for the subject of the theme this year. And Joe Abate, who also, Joe and Mary both were participate in our previous Memoirs projects. They both contributed stories of their own. So it's great to have them on the team this year. And if anybody's thinking about joining us, we're open. So Mary was at one of the events we had for the Memoirs back, I think it was like 2 years ago. And she just got all excited. She had an inspiration and she just had to share at that moment. She came running up to Jim and said, "You have to write about our veterans." So of course, what are we going to say? No? Yes. We'd all be proud. So thank you, Mary, for coming up with the theme, and it's just been a wonderful year this year. Okay, so if you are a veteran, please raise your hand or stand, because we want to thank you for keeping us safe and making us proud. Come on, guys, women, thank you. Any of the families, spouses, children of veterans, please raise your hands or stand. And I know there are many veterans that have been added to the Hall of Fame. So if there's any in this room, I know there is, please stand up so we can acknowledge you for making the Senate's. And now, are there any people in the audience that participated in our previous Memoirs projects by contributing stories? That's you, Mary. Joe's already standing. Bob? Ida Mae? John? Yay, thank you. Now I know this is, some of the high school teachers offered extra credit for their students to come tonight. Are there any high school students here? Yay! Pardon? Oh, and Danielle? Is Danielle here? There she is. She's a teacher that supported us and encouraged us to come. Thank you. It's important to local history to get it into the schools. Okay, I guess Jim and Mary, you're up.
Thank you all for coming. This is quite an honor. Today I was out for a walk and I got up to my yard and I looked up toward the house, and my rose bush had a rose that was in full bloom. November 17th. And it reminded me that this is what it's been like for me with this book. It's been unfolding and blossoming. And because of your stories, that was possible. I was just the conduit. I asked you if I could come into your homes, and you said yes. I asked you if you would just talk to me about what it was like, and you said yes. We knew there had been war stories told. We knew there were many books written, but we wanted your stories from the heart. What was it like to be a Fultonian? And likewise, there was a little bud, not yet blossomed, not ready yet. As I know, there are many stories out there still. And as a team, we regret that we don't have those stories yet. But we will. And they still need to be told. So Thank you to all of you that participated. Thank you to all of you who are willing to still participate. And the stories, like these roses, have thorns, and that's the war times. But the blossom is your story of Fulton, its beauty, growing up here, your families, and what that was like. I couldn't pick every rose in Fulton this year, but I'll try. So we will continue to hear the stories of veterans. Thank you. I'd like to introduce
All right. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Great. Wow. We have a full house here. And by the way, I tried to get around to say hi to everyone. Many of you that wrote stories or interviewed with Mary, I never got to meet you. I know your story from working on the book, but during intermission and afterwards, I'd like to personally say hi and thanks to those that we didn't get to. Mary and I are going to tag team this. We're going to read about 20 excerpts, very short excerpts from the over 50 stories that are in the book. And that was a difficult choice to make. We tried to get a cross-section of the different branches of service and, of course, the different wars. So we're going to do that. We're going to be doing that, and I think Betty's going to have a slideshow through that, which you'll be able to see. But I hope you don't mind if you'll just give me a second to talk more globally about this writers project, which is now in its 4th year. When I sat down with Betty all those years ago, you know, my dream was to get people to write, to tell their stories, because it's important. And then I like to read about writing, and I'm reading a book right now called Writing About Your Life. Very good book, and I recommend it. But I believe there's no coincidence. I believe everything's for a reason. And just yesterday, I read a little excerpt from the book, and I'm just going to share it with you now. So this man is a writer, and he's writing about how he wrote about his own life. And he talks about meeting a gentleman who served in World War II. And this man had never spoken a word to anybody about what his experience was like. And by the way, we found that, Mary especially found that, people were a little reluctant to talk about that experience for their own personal reasons, of course. So this man who wrote this book, his name is William Zinser, by the way, he's describing meeting this man who was a World War II veteran. So let's just read a little bit for you here. So the man said that he didn't think his wife wanted to hear about it, and he didn't think my in-laws wanted to hear about it, so I've been passive about the whole thing. But suddenly he opened up. For the first time in almost 50 years, it all started coming back to him in a flash. His grandsons stared at him in amazement. They had never seen their grandfather talk like this before. He just had to get it all out. And as he talked, his whole frame of mind altered. He said it felt good, and he realized he had a satisfying life. Well, that was pretty important for me to read. But then I went on to the next section, and really this is part 2 of why I think writing our memoirs is important. One is for you to experience what it's like to tell your story. But let me read the second part. So this writer goes on to say that he meets a child of this man. And he goes on to say, several middle-aged women said that their fathers never revealed what they did and what they thought about during the war. Those daughters felt that this was not only a deprivation for those men, but also they were deprived of knowing something important about their fathers. So I think, as painful as it can be sometimes to talk about these experiences, it's important to pass those on to our children, our grandchildren, so they can remember and they can know you personally. So those of you that wrote your story or worked with Mary to tell your story or worked with Joe, we thank you. Those that still have a story out there, we look forward to working with you. Are we ready to start the slideshow, do you know? Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Just so you know, if you haven't seen a copy of the book yet, we divided the stories into 3 sections. One was, and this was where the initiation for this book came from. When Mary approached me with this idea, my first thought was, there are thousands of books about World War II in Korea. Why do we want to read another one? And then Mary so wisely told me, because we need to know Fulton's story with these wars. And so we were able to talk to several people, or have them tell their story, or write their own memoir, about what it was like in the city of Fulton. What was it like to be somebody who was back here at home when their loved one went off to war? So that's section 1 of the book. Section 2 is World War II stories, people that had active duty, were actively involved with World War II. And section 3 is the Korean War. So we are doing the program tonight in those 3 sections. We're going to start off with the first section, which is stories from people who were at home or had someone they loved going to the war. Mary and I are going to tag team reading these. So I'm going to start, and because I didn't have a chance to say hi to everyone, is Evelyn Woodard Infantine here tonight? Evelyn? Okay, I still haven't met Evelyn. Evelyn is sister of Rosemary Woodard. You may know Rosemary, and I met Rosemary last year when she wrote a great memoir about the Oswego Hospital. But Rosemary, just when she heard we were doing this story, she said that she would contact her sister who had a story. I'm going to read an excerpt from that. And probably the title of this excerpt will explain to you what it was like for Rosemary. The title of her memoir is, Would My Uncles and Daddy Come Home Alive? And this is Evelyn talking here. My earliest recollection was at the age of 3 when I realized I was a military brat, impacted by World War II. There was a small white banner with 4 navy blue stars that hung in the front window of my grandparents, Charles and Ethel Harris's, rented, unique Victorian house on West 1st Street in Fulton. My grandmother explained to me that the 4 stars represented the 4 men in our family that were fighting for World War II. That explained why all the men in my life were absent, as Grandpa Harris was the only man at home living with us. The 4 stars represented my 3 uncles, Ben Harris, serving in the U.S. Army, Charles Harris, serving in the Merchant Marines, and Ward Harris, who was in the Royal Canadian Air Force. The 4th star was for my father, Donald F. Woodard, who was in the United States Marine Corps. There were many months that grew into years before I would enjoy their visit home to spoil me. For a child, those years were like an eternity. Throughout this time, there was always the dilemma in the back of everyone's mind, young and old. Would our uncles and daddy come home alive? When would this war be over? My other grandparents, Charles and Agnes Woodard, were most distraught by the news that their son-in-law, Raphael Garofalo, who was serving in the U.S. Army, had been captured by the Japanese in 1942 and was a prisoner of war on Caragordor Island. His wife, Ellen Woodard Garofalo, and our family were not sure they would ever see Ray alive again. The agony lasted 4 years, 4 long years, before anyone knew he and our American soldiers had survived the ordeal.
The next piece was written by my cousin Paul Cardinelli. For those of you who don't know me, my cousin Paul is the son of Henry. And Henry was the oldest of the Cardinelli family. My dad was the middle child, Gildo, and then there was Elmer. He was the youngest. Dad and Henry served in World War II, and Uncle Elmer served in Korea. He was a medic. My sister and I, when we were moving my mom, found 2 scrapbooks in the attic that we never knew existed. And it was full of Dad's memorabilia from the war. Of course, that prompted a lot of emotion for us, but it was a treasure. And I said to Paul when I asked him if he'd do this piece, it's important. We need to tell the story. So I'll read you Paul's piece. I don't think he's here. As our nation went to war, my dad and mom, Henry and Eleanor Cardinelli, realized that they had an obligation to their country and to their family. Rather than waiting to be drafted, he, the passionate one, and Mom, the practical one, decided that he should go into the Navy via Sampson Training Center, located not far from home at Geneva in the Finger Lakes. She would take in boarders to supplement the family income. Dad became a radar technician on a small naval ship and served in the Pacific until discharged in 1945. I was only 2.5 years old when the war ended in 1945, so I really have no recollection of the war itself. But my mom wrote in my baby book that my first words were Dada, Mama, Bye-bye, Hot, Sea, Dog, Bomb, and Plane. I don't believe the last 2 words are common for most babies. I'm sure I was very excited on BE and BJ Day, and I remember my dad returning home, entering the front door, lifting me up, tossing me in the air, and kissing my belly button. Those are Paul's words. Enjoy.
Is Ida Mae Thurlow here?
Yes.
Ida.
Okay.
Test. Okay.
Can you hear without this microphone, or is it?
Do we need the microphone? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. All right. It's just a little pain, but okay. It's such a pleasure to have Ida Mae here again. Ida Mae, this is her 3rd memoir. She started with this program in the very first year. She wrote a story about she had a child who was born deaf, and there were no services in the school district at that time, but there were in Rochester. So she went in to speak with Superintendent Glenn Clark about that, and he said, well, if we can get a bus to Rochester, we can get the kids there. But they didn't have a bus driver. So Ida Mae became a bus driver and drove her son and many children to Rochester for many, many years. She wrote a memoir about that. She wrote a memoir about going to school. And this year, she agreed to write a memoir, which I thought was particularly interesting because Ida Mae was a teenager during World War II, a teenage girl during World War II. And you'll see why I emphasize that when I read her piece here. And the name of her memoir, We Were Careful Never to Waste Anything. And here's Ida Mae as a teenager. Being a young teenager, there was a group I noticed at our airport in Fulton on Route 176, Soldier Boys. I had no clue what they were doing there. We lived right on Route 3, and they used to go by the house all the time. I noticed them. How could I not? Not at that age. One day I came up with this idea. I guess you could say it was a way to help our boys. It was also a way to get to see them up close. We saved all of our sugar and used 4 ration coupons so we could do this. It took a while to save them, but we did. And one Saturday, my aunt came out to the house and started baking cookies. And we baked, and we baked. We didn't bake for ourselves, we baked for the boys. It didn't enter my mind that I wouldn't get a cookie. I was doing my part. I forgot if we had 3 or 4 big brown bagfuls, like the kind of bags that the grocery stores used to give out. So we went over to the airport with those big bags to give to the soldiers. We got as far as the driveway, and they wouldn't let us go any farther. I asked, why can't I go? And the man said that the men were taking showers, outdoor showers. They let me leave the cookies, but I never got to see those men's faces. That's all I wanted, to see their faces when I handed them those cookies. But we weren't even allowed to get out of the car. Do you know how much that broke my heart?
The next piece was by Gladys Little. And for those of you who knew Gladys and Elmer Little, they were Fultonians for all their life. And I went to Gladys's apartment to interview her, and she reminded me that she was going to be 100 very soon. She didn't live to see that birthday, but she was a classy lady, and she and Elmer had quite a life together. Her piece is titled, If the Good Lord Allowed It, They Would Come Back. While he was over there, I wrote to Elmer 2 or 3 times a week. I worked in the office and had a typewriter, so I was able to write him more than most women who had to write by hand. He couldn't write much of what was happening, except we had a little code, and I wish you could have seen her face when she told me this. He would send me a card that said, "Oh, I ran into Edward somebody." Well, the E would mean England. Francis or Frank would mean France. We thought we were so clever. We had a standing joke. It started with my cousin who had enlisted in the Navy and was home on leave. I happened to have a navy blue suit, and she let me take her navy hat, and I had my picture taken in that outfit. I was going to send it to Elmer, because I was always saying I wanted to join the Navy. I was going to send the picture with the word "surprise" written on the back. But I got the stomach bug. When I told him about it, he said, "See, that's your punishment for what you were going to do. The surprise is on you, not me." Those memories are still very vivid in 2016, but in some ways, it seems like it's still 1944. The next piece is written by Marion Stanton, and I know Marion's here tonight. Thank you for coming, Marion. Marion is a Fultonian, and she just has Fulton running through her blood, through and through. As a young girl, I remember going to Murphy's gift shop. I can vaguely remember what it looked like then, but Marion hired me, and I worked for her for many years. I loved it. It was so fun. You got to see everybody in Fulton who had to buy a gift. Marion should probably write her own book, because she knows more about Fultonians and Fulton than I think most of us do. And she has shared those treasures with us in this memoir book. She's also a grand supporter of Fulton Public Library and many organizations that you would know in Fulton, and for that we thank her also. This story shares an incredible responsibility that she had as a young girl. And when she told me the story, I too was amazed. She was only a junior in high school. Most of my duties were helping recruit registered nurses to work at blood drives. Many doctors' wives, I discovered, were RNs in their former lives, and I'd call them up, and if possible, recruit them to work at the blood drive. Then I'd call donors who belonged to the so-called Gallon Club if their records indicated that they hadn't given within 60 days, and recruit them to donate again. Also, if there were any particular blood types that were badly needed at the time, I would see whom I might call with that blood type who could be recruited to donate. I also prepared news releases for the local papers, and as I recall, we always met our quota. Fulton was always a generous place. Toward the end of summer, our Red Cross director, Lucille Harbottle, was away for a few days, and I was proud to hear that she wanted me to perform one of her most important duties while she was away. The very vital service that Red Cross offices across the country performed of verifying for the military services the veracity of serious illness or death information in a serviceman's family at home. I knew exactly what needed to be done because I'd helped collect and organize the information over the time I'd worked at the Red Cross. I needed to speak with the family to understand what was happening or had happened and ascertain the necessary personal information regarding the serviceman, name, rank, serial number, unit designation, commanding officer's name if available, and his address. Thank you, Mary.
Well, we hope that first section gave you a good idea of the kinds of stories that were in there. We heard from people who were very young during World War II. Very young during World War II, people that were teenagers. But this last story from that section is for somebody that wasn't around during World War II, or the Korean War either. This is written by Steve Dexter, and it's a story about his grandfather, Donald Dexter, who served in World War II and also Korean War. And I worked with Steve last year. Steve is a longtime Fulton firefighter and the unofficial, but I think very important historian for the fire department. And he wrote a story for our memoir last year that was the history, not only the history of the Fulton Fire Department, but of the involvement with firefighters in his own family. There are several people in Steve's family that have been firefighters. Steve writes his own memoir, and he's actually a joy to work with. Many people will take a stab at writing and then turn it over, and then it becomes the job of the editor to work on it. But that's not how it was with Steve. It was more of a cooperative effort. Steve wrote the memoir. I would read it, give him some suggestions. He would rewrite it. I think we went back and forth 3 or 4 months doing that because Steve wanted it just perfect, and it was just perfect. And in this memoir, Steve shares that he gets to know this part of his grandfather in a way that he never did. His grandfather was one of those people that didn't talk much about his experience in the war until very near the end of his life, when he opened up, especially to Steve. And so Steve has taken it upon himself to write down these important memories. The name of his story, his memoir, Our Quiet Hero, is his dedication to his grandfather. And here's Steve talking. When I was in my mid-20s, I was at my parents' house, and somehow we started talking about Grandpa and the war. He told me that recently he had been over to our house and had actually started telling them some of the things that happened to him. He told them that during an engagement with the Germans, Grandpa's artillery crew was receiving and sending fire. Everyone was very busy, and he was helping one of the crew with their gun when a call for more ammunition came from another gun crew. It was the truck driver's responsibility to get that ammo from the truck, and Grandpa knew that it was his turn to make that trip. So he dropped what he was doing, and he started to run to his truck to retrieve the ammunition. Grandpa was stopped by one of the other truck drivers who told him to go back to what he was doing and that he would go get the ammunition for the gun crew. As soon as this other guy got to the truck, he took a direct hit from a German shell. Grandpa said the truck and the ammunition on it went up in a huge explosion. When everything settled, they couldn't find a trace of the truck or his buddy that took his turn in the ammo run. He was just gone, Grandpa said. So we're going to finish this section. Betty, there were, as we mentioned, there are several people in each section that we're not going to get a chance to hear their excerpt, and Betty has put together just a list of those people, and we can take a minute to reflect on them. I just looked down over that list and listed those people's names and the titles of those stories, and it just makes me remember the work that Mary and Joe and I did to bring these stories together. They're just fascinating stories, each and every one of them. And again, we are sorry we're not going to have time to read those all. We're going to move into the next section, which we aptly titled The War to End All Wars, certainly a phrase that's been used before. These are stories from people that were actually in World War II, and Mary's going to start us off on that.
Before I begin, I just want to say that those of you who we aren't reading an excerpt, and I sat with you, I can't even begin to tell you how you touched my heart and the hearts of the people who read the transcripts and the stories that were written because you took the time with me. Thank you so much. They are beautiful, and I'm honored. Thank you. The next memoir is a celebration of an entire family. Joe Vecchio was one of 8 brothers who served our country. I sat with Joe and his nephew Carm in Joe's kitchen. And never think you can visit an Italian without them thinking they need to feed you. Joe insisted that I have coffee, but then there were cookies. And, oh, did you know I made my own Italian bread? So I had to have... And he recalled those years with a tremendous sense of love, respect, and pride. So, Joe, I'm going to share that small excerpt, but I also want to do it with honor for Carm, Frank, Tony, Pete, Phil, Ace, Sam, and you. I remember when Pearl Harbor happened. I was going to high school at the time and still working on the muck. I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was before they invaded. I heard it on the radio. Roosevelt spoke. It was the day of infamy and all that. I was old enough to remember. But then I had 5 brothers already in the service, and they were drafted, except Ace. He was the only one who enlisted. The first one that went in was Tony, and he served as a medic. When my brothers left, I was 15 or 16 years old, and I wanted to leave too. But my father, he had me deferred because his other boys were gone, and he needed me to work with him. Because I was working on the farm, I was contributing to the war effort. But I wanted out of the muck. So I wrote a letter to the draft board and said that my father didn't need me anymore, and I wanted to be reclassified. A week later, they changed me from exempt to 1A. The next week, I was shipping out. That was 2 years after Pearl Harbor in 1943. I enlisted voluntarily. My father would have killed me if he'd known.
I think we saw John McGraw is here. John. I had the pleasure with working with John the very first year we did the Memoir project. Betty and I went over to the Towpath Towers where John lives, and we asked if people had stories about Fulton. We were doing the first year, we just did a general book about anything that had to do with Fulton that had a positive impact. And John spoke up that he was an auxiliary police officer in the city of Fulton. Well, I've grown up here, it's been 61 years, I never knew that Fulton had auxiliary police officers. So already I knew in that first year that I was going to learn a lot about Fulton. And John mentioned at that time that he had been in World War II, and we talked a little bit about it. And this year he agreed to work, I believe he worked primarily with you, Joe, on this, John? Joe Abate. Have we introduced Joe yet? I'm sorry, Joe Abate, who is a fine writer on his own, but also designed the wonderful front cover of our book and back cover of this year's memoir book. Did a great job on that. But Joe knows John from church, and they worked together on the interview, and then Joe wrote this piece, which takes us into the war, in the middle of fighting. As John explains, I just want to give you a little background for the piece I'm going to read. John had a little practice in what he was about to get into, but practice is one thing, and really doing it is another. And as they entered that beach to do the cleanup that I'll explain in a minute, he heard General Eisenhower's voice telling the men they were going into war. And John titles his piece, "We Were Just Doing Our Job." My first job was to clear the minefield, and I did clear it, but only because I was able to figure things out as I went along. There was so much we hadn't trained for that you couldn't train for. Most of what we did, we learned as we went along. It was an on-the-job training. One of the first things I discovered was something called a shoe mine, a small wooden mine with a block of dynamite inside it. When we found this device, that was when we started using our bayonets and getting down on our hands and knees to probe for the mines. We had our mine detectors, but shoe mines weren't detectable. These had to be dug out by hand. They were almost to the surface, and when I found one, I dug the dirt away and felt around it. I dug and dug until I could get my fingers underneath it. Then I felt around it to make sure there was nothing else with it, just a mine. When I lifted it from the ground, I had a live mine in my hand.
The next excerpt is about a gentleman that all of you know. You'd recognize him if I asked him to stand up. We saw him in the Army-Navy store, later known as Harris's. Many of you have seen him on the golf course. And he's grown up in Fulton and served his church and his community for many, many years. And his family has too. Andrew Fisher, always Mr. Fisher to me, was from a family of brothers who served also. His brother Mike was Army, Andy was Marine Corps, and his brother John was also Marine Corps. His interview with me was a familiar story. He was the son of immigrant parents who did as you were told. You were grateful for everything you had, and sometimes for what you didn't have. And even though he knew they were poor, nothing much mattered except family. Mr. Fisher shared his story with me about leaving Fulton, and he said he'd never really been anywhere other than Fulton and Oswego, maybe once or twice to Syracuse. After Camp Lejeune, we were sent overseas on the French Liberty ship heading toward Hawaii. Though I graduated from high school, I didn't understand the geography of where I was going. My family didn't own a car, and I had only ever been to Oswego and Syracuse in all my life. That's about all. So we headed off on the ship, and we get to Hawaii. We had to go through the Panama Canal. The first 3 or 4 days on that ship, we had to get our sea legs. We arrived at Oahu, where we had a big transit center, where troops were sent to replace those who'd been in battle. From there, we were sent to Guam. We arrived in Guam, and we were the first replacements for those who had fought the battle. I wasn't part of the invasion at all. We had to come to clean up the island. That meant going out every day on patrol, going into the woods and caves to see if you could find dead bodies. Thank you, Mr. Fisher. The next piece is about a lady. Her name is Veronica Federici, better known to those who love her as Ronnie. And she was a Navy wave. And I remember her passing by my house. I lived on 6th Street right by Nestle, going to work at Nestle. And her son Mike was in school at St. Mary's with me. And I would not have known that she was a Navy wave, except for the fact that when we began this project, when we publicized it, we also went to senior living centers and asked the directors to put us in touch with anyone who might have been in the service or their family member had been. And that's how I found out about Ronnie. She also had, her son Mike contributed to the memoir, so I have 2 sections, one by Ronnie and one by Mike. When I was working at Nestle, I was a secretary. So when I joined the Navy, I became a secretary and did all the paperwork. This was during World War II, and even our general wondered what the heck we were doing in this war. There were young men who were only 16 and 17 years old who became sailors and were sent overseas. Sadly, they didn't all make it back, but a lot of them did. Thank you, God. And Mike says, when I reflect on Mom's life, I think of the courage of a single young woman in her early 20s, leaving the comfort and security of her family and a life she knew out of a sense of duty for her country. I think of my mom's action, like that of other young men and women of that era, with awesome respect. They truly are the greatest generation.
Well, as I said earlier, that many of you that are in this book I haven't had a chance to read, but this next man is a friend of mine. I've known him for a long time. I was reflecting on when I met Bob Green. And I don't know if you remember Bob, but it was outside the YMCA when it was back on Oneida Street. Bob's an early morning swimmer, so am I. And before the Granby Pool opened, the Y on Oneida Street was where you did your swimming. And I remember a few early morning snowstorms where we waited for the doors to open so we could get in and take our swim. Bob still swims laps at Granby. He still outswims me every day. But when Mary and I and Betty and Joe started talking about doing this project, we wanted to get as many stories as we could. And I knew Bob was a veteran of World War II, and I wanted to get his story down. Bob's a busy guy, though. It's hard to track him down. So after a meeting at Canale's restaurant in Oswego, he agreed to let me interview him in his car. So that's where this story came from. And just to give you a little preface on this, and I realize as you're listening to these excerpts that you're not hearing each person's full story, but hopefully you're getting the gist of it. Bob was in the Navy, and he arrives at Pearl Harbor shortly after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Bob calls his piece, "Every Sailor Felt a Sense of Pride." Here's Bob talking. "We were loaded aboard a troop ship named Lula Lakes, a reconverted merchant marine cargo ship. We broke down and ended up in Pearl Harbor for 3 weeks. We were allowed one night liberty in Honolulu. We worked out and swam in the base pool. We enjoyed fresh pineapple and a lot of other fruits. It was quite a sight to see the devastation from the Japanese attack. Actually, the war with Japan ended while we were there, VJ Day. I heard about the war ending in the evening. I was in the exercise room when an officer said it was over. Then the cheering started and the rockets went off. We were sure. We didn't doubt it." And I want to read one other section that Bob wrote. And I thought this was pretty brave of Bob to say this, because I think this is a hard thing to admit, but I think he's telling the truth here. So later on in his story, Bob said, "Anyone who was in the war that said they were not scared would be lying. I was fortunate to not have seen combat, thus being very thankful and relieved at the time. I was proud to serve my country, but very fortunate I didn't have to get involved in actual combat. Amen. I feel very bad for those who went before me, particularly a good friend, Bob Pooler, who lost his life. My brother Gerald was also in the Navy before me. He was on the USS Savannah, which saw some combat, and he would not talk about it. That's the way it was with the ones who saw combat. They wanted to forget the experience."
Ivan Parsons is here with us tonight with his wife Fern, and Ivan and Fern invited me into their home, and Ivan told me his story. I've known him a long, long time. My husband's family and their family were great friends, Mount Pleasant Church. They grew up together, the kids did, and Ivan was pretty open about all of his thoughts during that time. His piece is titled, "I Needed Some Adventure in My Life." I also wanted to mention that Ivan had two brothers, Orrin and Ovid, and Orrin was in the Air Force, and Orrin passed away last week on Veterans Day. He was 92. By then I was 17. That's when I thought it was a good idea to enlist. If I waited until I was 18, they could draft me and then put me any place they wanted to. But I liked the water, and that's why I joined the Navy. At age 17, I had my choice, and I chose the Navy. My older brothers wanted to serve too. Unfortunately, Charlie lost his arm in an accident at Sealright, so he didn't get drafted. Orrin joined the Air Force, and they sent him to school to learn to patch airplanes that got damaged, the fuselage. Ovid also joined the Air Force. They called it the Army Air Force then. He was a gunner on a B-24, a tail gunner. And I was a radio man too. And that's what I was in the Navy. I was a radio operator. I copied code, Morse code, for 6 hours at a time. My family didn't say much about any of us enlisting. My father never said a word. My mother just took it, even though it bothered her. She was the best person in the world, you know. She was sort of a sentimental person. That stuff got to her. She didn't say much, but I knew how she felt. Another one of her boys was going away. At this time, we'd like to take a 10 to 15 minute intermission. There are refreshments, and you can purchase books. And when we return, you're going to see a short video of people who contributed to the book and have already received their books. And we'd like you to share that with you. So thank you to all of you for sitting through the first half. And when we come back, we've got more stories. Thank you. This book is about those two wars and how you folks took upon yourselves to be part of that time period. Mario Galetta, Larry Barker, Eleanor Hackett, Armand Bernardo, Peg Williams, and Wally Ozer. Thank you so much for being here.
And we're going to take just a little bit of we're going to give you a copy of the book and talk to you a little bit about it and maybe ask you a few questions. So we know, Mario, you were in the Air Force, and we were going to ask, out of all of the experiences you had there, could you come up with maybe one quick memory of what that was like for you? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, there was probably one that I remember. There was a shuttle mission. We flew and dropped supplies to the people in Warsaw. They were surrounded by the Germans, and they were in need of supplies, ammunition, and food, and I had a brother who was he was a gunner in the 15th Air Force. They were stationed in the lower part of Italy, down around the toe of Italy. He was in the 15th Air Force with the B-24s. I was on B-17. We arranged a meeting halfway between both airfields, and I was able to spend the day with my brother.
What a great memory. Thank you.
Thank
Mary?
you. Thank you,
Mary,
Mario.
would you like to give the book to Mario? And thank you.
Thank you so much.
One quick memory of being on the ship, something that stands out in your mind about being on a ship?
Everything.
It was your whole world?
No. Well, I went on in 1950 and got off on 54.
Yeah.
So I was on the same carrier all that time.
Right.
And I got to know it like the back of my hand.
I bet you did.
And, some of the things we did a lot of escort duty when we went after we got to Korea. And they were escorting all the refugees and everything out of there. And one night we were in Sasebo. We got underway. We went to Yakutka. Nobody knew anything about it. They said, how come? Nobody seemed to know much. and they loaded 20-something Corsair fighters on the ship. All been reconditioned in San Diego. No insignias, no nothing on them. And then we got underway. We had 2 destroyers with us, and nobody told us where we were going. We just were going. And we went anchored in harbor in French Indochina. And then we went on condition 1. Everything was ready for trouble.
Your stories, just as good in the book too. Thank you so much. One quick memory of what it was like when he wasn't at home.
He went in for the 1 year back then, and we got married at the end of that because we thought he was going to be out. We didn't know war was coming on, so we suffered through the whole war.
Yeah, so he was gone for the whole war. Yeah. Well, we thank you for your story. It's a beautiful story, and I can't wait for you all to read it. So thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Armand, one of the things I remember about you is you had several siblings who served in the war.
Yeah.
How many total?
Well, it was 4 or 5.
5. And all served. This is World War II.
Yes.
Yes. In what branch of the service did you?
The Army.
The Army. Do you have a real quick memory for us? Hard to pick one, huh? Yeah. Well, we thank you very much for your contribution. It's a fascinating story. You can talk a little bit about, were you one of the younger ones?
Yes.
So you remember your older brothers going off to war. It's a very moving story. Armand. Now, Peg, Mary interviewed your husband, who I know is Dr. Williams. And so were you married to the doctor when he was in the service?
Yes.
Yes. What branch of the service?
He was in the Air Force.
Okay.
And,
right.
Well, you just go along on your everyday living, and he was home the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. But he still served our country.
Oh, yes,
yeah.
He did. Yes, he did, for 2 years.
And you served as his wife, too. As you said, life goes on. Somebody has to carry on.
That's right. Yeah.
So we thank you for that very much.
Well, you're very welcome.
How about a quick memory of what that experience was like for you?
Well, I ended up in the Marines because the Air Force wouldn't take me. They didn't think my eyesight was good enough. So I went down to Paris Island and shot expert for them. What I remember most was the day it ended. I was on my way to, we figured, the invasion of Japan. And I was on the airplane, and the way I told my children, the Japanese heard I was coming and they quit. And they believed me. And in the event, I'll never forget the day that Harry Truman pushed the button. And no matter what my politics were, I vowed never to forget my obligation and admiration to him for having the guts to do that. He saved millions of American lives.
So, shall we start with Sophie? And Sophie and I were neighbors in Fulton, so I know you. And you wrote a little bit about what Fulton was like back when Michael was in the war.
Yeah.
And Mary, I heard Mary mention something about where the high school is now was all farmland.
Oh, farmland.
Yeah.
Plus there was the ice house down there.
Right. Before refrigerators, right? Well, we want to thank you for your contribution to the book and for telling. We wanted not just the soldiers' stories, but we wanted also the stories of people who sent those soldiers off to war and stayed home. So how about a round of applause for Sophie?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, Norman, you were in World War II? Yes. And what branch of the service were you in? In the Navy. And one of the things that I remember about you is that you had several brothers who also served.
Yeah.
Do you remember how many total?
There was 5 of us.
Yeah. And we have 2 other brothers in this book. I don't know if Norman knows that or not. Jimmy and Patrick stories are in the book as well. So we thank you and your family for all the service that you did for our country during the war.
Thank you so much, Norman. There's your book. Thank you.
Tom Marshall. Now, Tom, you mentioned you weren't in the fighting, but which branch of the service were you in?
Marine Corps.
Marine Corps. Yeah. Can you give us one quick, like real quick, because we don't have a lot of time on the tape. Real quick memory. Just one thing that comes to mind and share, or is there too many to think about?
Memory I got was you could never go to sleep because it moved all the time. You know, this would break out, that would break out, and the Marine Corps did all that stuff.
Great.
They had to go wherever they wanted to go.
Yeah. Well, we thank you for your service that you were in. Which war was that?
I went in at the end of the Korean War.
Okay.
And got out beginning of Vietnam.
Wow. Yeah. So we appreciate your story very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tom Warpaul. Yes. And Tom, which branch of the service were you in?
Army.
In the Army. Yep. And you served during which war?
No.
No. Would you remember the years that you served?
In Germany.
You were in Germany. Yes. Okay. Well, we thank you very much for your service.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the interview. Roxanne, thank you so much for having us today. It was such an honor to have time to spend with you and have you tell us your story for the Fulton Memoir Project. Your memories of your dad and your growing up with him and his stories has been wonderful for me to hear, and also you shared it so eloquently in your own writing.
That was part of the goal of this book, is to get these stories down. And like you said, some families never shared those kinds of stories. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we really appreciate that.
I was lucky enough to to have grandparents that actually lived with me.
Mm-hmm.
So...
they actually lived in the same house with you. Mary and I were just talking about, we lived next door to our grandparents, but you lived in the same house. Mm-hmm. That's great.
So you always were with them and shared part of their life.
Part of their life, yeah. That's great. Well, we have a book to give you, your copy of the book. Maybe Mary will officially give that to you. But isn't that a beautiful cover?
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful cover. Joe designed the cover, actually. And this is... it was tough coming up with a picture. This is one of the families that are in the book, but we hope it will represent all the families. And one other thing, we had many people who actually served in the war, but we also wanted stories from children and spouses of people. So your story actually helped us with that part of the war too. So thank you very much for your contributions.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Roxanne. Thank you so much. This gentleman is also the son of immigrant parents, and he told me a story one day about seeing a pair of skis at Montgomery Ward's. And as a young man, he had odd jobs, and he earned some money, and he saved. And he wanted those skis, but he knew he couldn't afford them. So he went home, and he was talking to his sister about it. And his sister said, "Tell you what, you buy one ski, I'll buy the other one." If you look up the word humility in the dictionary, you'll see this man's picture. Father Fuchs has served us for many, many years. He's 92 and he never quits. He's here tonight. Father, I don't know where you're sitting. There he is. Out of high school, Father left and went off to Purdue University to pursue a career in engineering. But things got changed when World War II started and he was drafted. And the rest of the story, as they say, is history. I can't possibly begin to share the enormity of his 92 years. But one of the most notable times was that of his time as bodyguard to Judge Jackson during the trials at Nuremberg. Father's life has been a testimony of service to God and country. I'm so very proud to know him and honored to share this small excerpt of his story. Our 26th Regiment, 3rd Battalion, was fully involved east of the Achaean in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, where I was wounded on November 19th. Our whole squad was wiped out that day. Whitney Swarthout, our platoon leader, who had been with the 1st Division since the African campaign, was due for a prized 30-day leave when he became the first soldier I saw get killed. Deadly shrapnel from the German 88mm guns burst in the pine trees, spraying all over the ground. Evacuated through Cherbourg, I spent 3 months at the Army Hospital in Blandford, England. The Army took thousands of casualties in the Hurtgen Forest, even before the Battle of the Bulge began in December. I returned to my outfit in February 1945 to the very same area that was lost and recovered by the Army after the Bulge. I didn't recognize anybody. There wasn't anybody I knew from before. When I got hit, everybody in our squad and our platoon was wiped out, either killed or wounded. I learned enough about the German language, so when I came back, I said I knew enough German, maybe I could be of some help interrogating prisoners. So they took me from the line company back to the headquarters company. Looking back on my time in the war, I try to remember that we knew we were in this together. In high school, we had courses in civics about the appreciation of our government and our way of life. It was how Norman Rockwell portrayed the era, as a very contented way of life. There was an enormous sense of common responsibility, and we were all just doing our part. It wasn't unusual. Thank you, Father.
So a few months into the program, I got an email from the Terranova family that they heard we were doing this project and they wanted to put together a piece for it. This is so this piece that I'm going to read an excerpt from was from 3 children of Carmela Terranova. And you'll notice Carmela and family on the front cover. And it was a really difficult decision to make, you know, what to use for a front cover when we had so many families to represent. But we thought with Carmela's parents and other family members on the cover, and there was even a dog in the cover, if you see that, so kind of represented families. So with their approval, we used that for the cover. Donna's here tonight. Donna Terranova-Siebers here. Donna, you want to just... And we have someone in Australia. One of the brothers is in Australia, and the other is in Florida. So Donna's here representing these 3 children, and they wrote this piece together. It needed very little editing, and we thank you for doing that. remembering Dad's service to our country, which brings us into the harsh realities of war. On August 7th, 1942, our dad, Marine Private First Class Carmela Terranova Infantryman L31, went ashore in Guadalcanal and into battle. The Navy had moved ships into the waters off Guadalcanal to both unload more supplies and provide cover for the Marines. Over the next 5 months, the Marines fought the Japanese as the sides alternated taking the airstrip. Much has been written on the battles of Guadalcanal. These include some historic fights, such as the Battle of Tenura River, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, and the Battle of Manzanku River. Dad wasn't sure which battles he fought in because, as he would say, historians may have organized the battles, but nobody announced that today we're going to be fighting such and such battle. We knew that we fought some days and not others. Dad also had to kill some Japanese up close. It was either them or me. I didn't feel too good about it, but what choice did I have? He says he buried the first soldier he killed and said a prayer over his grave, musing to the naturally unresponsive Japanese soldier. Would you have done the same for me? Is Carl Beatty here tonight? No. Carl was another Mary interview. I haven't met Carl. I was hoping to meet him tonight. We're going to stay in the reality of war a little bit here. Carl served in the Army, and I think the title of his memoir speaks for his piece. For the next 81 days, I was a prisoner of war. I was captured on a day when the Germans attacked my unit pretty good. We had made a night attack in the dark, and I walked for 3 or 4 hours with the whole company. We started walking at about 2 at night, and about 4 or 5 o'clock before we got close to where we were going to have this battle. And it sure was a battle. We just walked right into it. Machine guns killed most of us before we could even get squared away. I will say something for the Germans. They could fight. The day that final battle for me, at least half the guys who went into battle were killed. I guess the guys that were leading us weren't too smart to get us in that kind of trouble, but you didn't think more or less twice about it. Staying alive was what you had on your mind. They had us nailed down, and we stayed nailed down. I lay 35 yards from the enemy lines, and if you moved around, you got shot at. So I learned to lay pretty still. Then about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after I'd been laying there since 6 o'clock in the morning, I felt something on my wrist. I kind of looked up. I was looking straight into the eyes of a German, trying to get my wristwatch off. He thought I was dead. He hollered, and one of his sergeants came over and said, "Aufstehen." I didn't know what that meant till I realized it meant get up. But I got up, and then I fell right back down because I'd been laying down so long. So he called some guys to get me up, and they had me under both arms and started walking me around. He saw that I was a sergeant and called someone over who could speak English. That guy said, "Look after your men now and see what you can do for them." And for the next 81 days, I was a prisoner of war.
The next memoir story should be an exclusive for Hollywood. It truly is a story of love, trust, and patience. This couple invited me to their home for an interview, and it was wonderful. We began talking, and as we did, I noticed that he would start to talk, and she would finish the sentence. She would start to talk, and he would finish the sentence. And I think maybe when you're married long enough, that's what happens. They were married for 70 years, and sadly, Muriel Keeney died this past September. Don's story is of his service in World War II. And we were very sorry to lose Muriel. I had a girlfriend at the time, Muriel Balcom, who was from Valney and who would become my wife. She didn't have too much to say about my going into the service. And then Muriel says, I worked at Nestle at the time, and our hospital had a nurse's aid course. They encouraged people to take it because nurses were being drafted. A friend of ours, Mrs. Foster, volunteered to pick us up and take us up to the class. After we started working at the hospital, she volunteered to pick us up and take us home after our duty. The attitude back then was to enlist. Everyone thought, look, the Germans can't do that to us. When Donald told me he had enlisted, I was frightened, but I was proud. I promised to write him every day, and I still have his letters. I sent him packages. And Donald said, she sent me a beautiful fountain pen. I still have it, and I still have all her letters. We're going to move to the Korean theater now, but I just want to say something because I need to. There are several veterans here tonight, again, who haven't been highlighted and we're not reading an excerpt. Please understand that in no way does that diminish the stories they had to tell me. One gentleman shared with me that the love of his life that he proposed to before he left, he carried around her 8x10 picture in his coat the whole time. And he came home to her, and she was engaged to somebody else. He said, hey, wait a minute. I proposed to you. I bought you a cedar chest. And it was okay, because she knew that he was really the one. And the other guy, they were friends anyway. Thanks, Mr. Maya. There are so many stories, and they're so touching, and you can't help but hear them or read them and know that there was sacrifice, and know that those members of that family, not just the ones who served, but the members of the family, were always prayerful, always hopeful that their child, their brother, their sister, their husband would be okay. I can't tell you that most often there wasn't a dry eye. I was crying, or they were crying, or both of us were. That's the way it was. It was a beautiful time that I shared with them. Our next theater is the Korean theater. And this is an interesting story. I've got my notes here, but I think I'm going to do this one off the cuff because I can't tell you. I went to interview Norman Smith, and you saw Norman. And I looked at him and I thought, I know you. Why do I know you? And then it clicked. Oh, Smith. Jimmy Smith. Sure, I knew that face. Pat Smith. I knew that face. I've been a Fultonian all my life. They were brothers, but I didn't know Norm. So when I finished my interview with Norm, I called Jimmy and I said, would you sit with me? And he said, I don't have much to tell you. And I said, will you please? He said, sure. So then I called Pat and he said, I don't have anything to tell you. I don't want to do this. I don't have anything to tell you. And I said, Pat, I promise, this is not about what you did during the war. I want to know what it was like for you and your brothers and your mom and your dad. What was it like on Emory Road when you grew up? So he said yes. And he and Claudette invited me to their home. Jim invited me to his home. And Linda and Baba were there, and both men shared their stories. For any of you who saw Bridge Street, Jimmy was gracious and went on that with us the other day, as did Mr. Chiarello. And Pat's story is not unlike others you've heard. There were 6 boys that served, and they were all Fultonians. They hung out with guys that you'd know. Will Hackett, Bud Seymour, and many others. So Jim, Pat, Norm, Leon, Ernest, William, thank you for your service. We got the newspaper every day, and there would always be headlines about what was going on in the war. My brother Norm was over in the Pacific, and we used to pay attention to what was going on over there. One time, we got an article in the paper about his PT boat that saved 17 guys. That was a big thing. I had a brother who was kind of a hero. I remember how Mom and Dad were during the war. Mom was like most other mothers, and Dad was a lot more concerned than I think we originally thought. He would sit and think a lot about what was going on with his boys over there and all. When my brothers came home, he'd give them a hug and say, "I'm glad you're home," and then went back to work. Parents used to hang stars in the window for their boys or girls who were in the war. Right away, my mom put up 2 stars, and another few months later, went up another star. Soon, she had 5 stars up. If someone was killed in action, a gold star went up. Luckily for us, we never had to have a gold star. This story that I need to share with you was after the recorder was off. And I remember I said to Pat, "Tell me what it was like when you came home." And he said, "That's a funny story. My mom was in the kitchen, and nobody knew I was coming home. And I walked in the back door, and she was standing there." He said, "I think she had a pot in her hand. And she dropped it, and she screamed, and my dad came running across the road, didn't know what was wrong, and I picked her up and hugged her, and she was crying, and then my dad was crying." That's Fulton. That's the stories I heard. Thanks, Pat.
This was really a different experience for me this year. In the previous years, I met just about everybody that did a memoir. Many people wrote their own memoirs, but this year, because of the circumstances, it was a lot of interviews, and Mary did the majority of those. But Leo Chiarello, I've known for a long time, lifelong Fultonian, contributor to Fulton in many, many ways. It was wonderful. His son Steve and daughter-in-law Kathy and I, we all went to school together. So I knew the family, and I knew his contributions to Fulton, and it was such a pleasure to work on his memoir. I took 2 different pieces from Leo's memoir that I thought were things that he talked about that not everybody did, that I learned from, and thought we would share those with you tonight, just the perspective of what it meant to be in war. For one, being in the Korean War, you don't think about the weather too much in Korea, but here's what Leo had to say about weather in Korea. "Because the winters were so brutal with the snow and the cold, of all the things I remember in Korea, the worst of it was going through those winters. What they used for heat was big steel drums filled with kerosene. We had down sleeping bags and wool blankets. We had insulated boots. They were so warm your feet would perspire if you did a lot of activity. We had big parkas. We were much better off than the World War II guys. But I go to bed at night thinking, I'm nice and warm and snug, but I should be at home." Then the other section is about faith. One year at Christmas time, it wasn't a pope, but a high-ranking cardinal came to say Mass with the guys. I was there for that. I was a man of faith, and it helped me get through this. I had a rosary and a prayer book that I brought with me. I still have it, in fact. Actually, I should say that in spite of the fear and so forth, I did have my faith in the Lord. I said, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I'm not going to change it. So our last reading tonight is from Leonard Snow. Leonard is here tonight. Leonard, raise your hand, please. Yes, and I got a chance to shake your hand. Again, Leonard was somebody who I read and worked on the memoir, but had never met until tonight. A couple of weeks ago, you heard in the paper that one of our soldiers was coming home after many years, Joseph Trapasso. And his family, the Trapasso family, was finally able to put his body to rest. And Leonard has a similar story that he tells. It's called One Brother Didn't Come Home. Let me just take a step back here. Leonard served in the Marines, and that's part of his memoir. But a big part of his memoir was being the youngest brother at home, seeing his older brothers go away. So one brother didn't come home. When my older brothers got to the age, they went to fight in Korea and joined my brother Frank there. They all joined. None were drafted. So our family had 4 brothers serving in the Army. I was 14 at the time. My father and mother received a letter from the United States Department saying that our family had 4 sons in Korea and that we would be allowed to choose one of them to bring back home. I read the letter and I listened to my mom and dad, who went through a lot of struggle about this. My oldest brother said, "Bring the youngest one home." And the youngest said, "Bring the oldest home." I really couldn't see how they could decide, and they never did choose one. So they all just stayed. But one of my brothers didn't come home. One day when I was in school, my brother Ronald ended up in Korea very early in the war there, and we lost him on November 2nd, 1950. One day while I was in school, my teacher told me to go home because my mom wanted me. When I got home, Mom told me that they had lost Ronald. And that began the process of receiving a lot of letters from the military and such. Ronald became missing in action. The story of his death is well documented. They were able to tell us about the battle he was in, where he was lost, and that they couldn't find any of his remains. So Leonard, we want to pray for your family that someday you'll have the same situation that happened for the Trapasso family here, and that you'll be able to bring your brother home. Could we have a round of applause for our veterans tonight?
Just want to give a chance to read the other names from the Korean War.
I think Betty's going to come up and close the evening for us.
Well, a project like this takes a lot of people. If you look at the back of your program, many of them are listed here. And we especially want to thank the project team. If you would kindly come up and acknowledge that each one of them brought their talents, passion, and their pride in our veterans. When we started this project 4 years ago, Jim and I were adamant that it had to be positive about Fulton. And I think we've succeeded in keeping that going. Thank you all for your support. Thank you all for coming.